present our first presenter, Paula Caplan.
Hi, I'm short. Well, I'm just short. So. Thank you. Thanks, that's great. Is this all right? Can you hear me now? Hi. Thank you for that very moving and beautiful introduction. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm very touched that nobody wants feedback. How about if I just do this? Can you hear me back there? Okay, now that's better. Okay, I'm really honored to be here, and I was very touched to be invited to speak. I have to tell you, when I imagined giving a talk about veterans at this time of the morning, I thought if 10 people show up, it'll be amazing. But now I know why you came. It was to hear Joe. He's wonderful. I'm going to speak this morning about war veterans, but I'm also going to speak about all of us in this room. In the end of March, Psychology Today asked me to start writing a blog for them. And they said, we want you to write a blog because you're interested in a lot of different things. Well, since the end of March, I wrote about 45 essays, and they were about a very wide variety of subjects. About a dozen of those had to do with veterans, with war veterans in one way or another. And they tell you how many views you've had for each of your essays. And I can tell you that except for one of the essays about veterans, all of the others have had between 30% and 3% the number of views of any other subject I've written about. And the one with the least was the one I wrote the most recently, and it was about how in a VA gift shop, there was a hat for sale. And on the hat was written, "This vet is medicated for your protection." This is the kind of thing we're dealing with. Now, people in this room care. You care because you're therapists, or you've worked in the mental health system, or you've been trying to get services and help and support in the mental health system. And the people in this room are obviously here because you've challenged accepted practices that are hurtful to people who are already suffering, or else you wouldn't be here today. Now, we remember how many people wanted to help the nation heal right after 9/11. The presence of millions of veterans every day in this country, way before 9/11, and certainly since then, and many more about to come back from Iraq, is transforming our nation in ways that we have no idea how to comprehend yet. And the problem with trying to begin to comprehend how the presence of millions of veterans, there are 23 million veterans from all wars now since World War II, in this nation, the problem with trying to understand what is happening to this country as a result of having all these people who have been at war, who have confronted life and death and danger and grief and terror and loss of innocence and moral conflicts, moral anguish, and then who try to come back and fit in. The problem is that Americans don't want to think about veterans. First of all, who wants to think about war? It's upsetting. Secondly, veterans get isolated. They don't tend to talk about what they've been through when they come back, and there are several reasons for that. And then civilians are not likely to ask them if they want to talk. They tend not to talk because they're afraid they're crazy. Nobody's told them that they're not. Nobody's told them that if war devastated them, That's a healthy, normal, human reaction. It's a reaction we should treasure as part of our humanity. And so when they can't sleep at night, and when they have flashbacks, and when there are fireworks, and they go back to where they were at war in their minds, they think they're crazy. Because you know what? Other people aren't talking about this. So they think they're crazy. Often they've been told they're crazy. What happens if you go to a therapist in the military? Some of them are really good. Please hear me say that. Some of them are really good. And some of them say, you're trying to get out of combat. You're just pretending to be mentally ill. When they go to the VA, well, first of all, try to get seen at the VA. You may be aware that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California, here the Federal Court of Appeals, recently ruled on a Veterans for Common Sense lawsuit. And the ruling was that the VA's mental health services, the whole system was shameful. Imagine a court using that word, shameful, and they ordered a complete overhaul. And what did the VA do? 3 months later, they appealed the ruling. They didn't say, let's put all our time and money and energy into making this better, into giving vets the help they need. They're appealing the ruling. They're spending enormous resources on that appeal. So veterans don't talk to us because VA doctors have often told them, you're crazy, you're mentally ill, and you will be this way the rest of your life. You know about David Oakes, Mind Freedom International's wonderful new campaign, the equivalent of It Gets Better. You can get a label and still have a life, and you can feel better. That's not what they're told by most VA doctors. Not all. Some of them are really good, and please hear me say that. So they don't talk to us because they're afraid they're crazy. They're afraid you'll think they're crazy. They don't talk to us because they don't want to burden us, because what they've been through is so horrific. And many of them signed up because they'll tell you, I went over there to protect this country and to protect the people I love. So they can't imagine coming back and telling people they care about what it's really like. They don't want you to have to live with what they have to live with all the time now. And a third reason that vets don't tend to talk to us is because they're afraid, what if they do try and we don't understand? Right, then the chasm they feel between themselves and everybody else is going to be even greater. So it's absolutely terrifying. Now, why don't a lot of civilians ask to hear? Well, so I hear this all the time. Civilians who aren't therapists will say, well, I'm not a therapist, so what could I do? I even hear people say, well, her boyfriend broke up with her and she was really upset, but I didn't talk to her because I'm not a therapist. We used to call it friendship. We used to call it human connection. And people can't do that. I can't do that. I guess you have to be an expert. So the result is that because 90% of Americans have never been in the military, never mind being at war, we haven't a clue what it's really like. And whatever your politics, whatever you feel about war in general, whatever you feel about particular wars, what I'm saying to you about veterans and what we can do for them and for ourselves applies. You'll hear in a little bit about a bit of what my own politics are. You can probably guess what they are. So many of you know that starting in 1985, I began to learn that, to my amazement, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was not scientific, and that research shows that assigning labels does not help at all in figuring out how to help somebody who's suffering. That's really important. That's a bit of the science we all need to spread around, because it's not enough just to say, well, I hate labels. You can also tell people, yeah, and you know what? Labeling somebody doesn't help you know how to help them. And it does not correlate with prognosis, and it does not correlate with outcome. Okay, so I was learning all of this, and I was quite horrified, because I used to teach the DSM to my graduate students as an advocate. They've got all these decision trees. It's beautiful. It's logical. They say it's scientifically based. What could be better? So I was quite shocked. I went through my own loss of innocence when I ended up on 2 DSM-4 committees, and then resigned when I saw that they ignore the science, or they distort it, or they out and out lie about it. Well, I also learned in those decades, since 1985, that it's not just that labels don't help, it's that they hurt. And that, as many of you in this room know, you can lose your job or fail to get one, you can lose custody of your children, you can lose your right to make decisions about your medical and legal affairs, you can lose your health insurance or have skyrocketing premiums because now you have a pre-existing condition. So and you can also die or nearly die because you have a physical problem, but because people think you're mentally ill, they don't pay attention to the physical problems. I have a website called, and please write this down, psychdiagnosis, P-S-Y-C-H, diagnosis.net. On that website, there are 53 stories of people whose lives have been destroyed in one way or another by getting a diagnosis. I'm not even talking about drugs or being sexually assaulted by their therapist. I'm talking about their lives were ruined because they got a diagnostic label. So I had been immersed in all of this for years. And many years ago, I thought, nobody's listening. I wrote a book about it. I edited a book about it. I wrote a play about it called Call Me Crazy, which is a comedy drama with music. Nothing was changing. And so I thought, what do we need? Congressional hearings. Because most people think diagnosis is regulated by the FDA, isn't it? Don't they regulate everything? Don't they protect us from everything that's harmful? Well, of course, diagnosis is not regulated by anybody. So I thought, great, let's have congressional hearings. And that way people who can say, I want my label because that way my insurance pays for my therapy, they can say that. And the ones who've been destroyed because of getting a label can say that. And we can have a national conversation about how to minimize the harm. Well, I tried to do that. On psychdiagnosis.net, there's still a petition that's been there for years. Please sign it. Have your group sign it. It's just a request for congressional hearings about psychiatric diagnosis. Of course, nobody in Congress listened. I sent out a press release to the media. Not a single media person even called to ask a question. Certainly nobody wrote about it. So I was immersed in all of that in 2003 when I was at a conference, the annual conference of the Association for Women in Psychology, a wonderful organization, by the way. And Maureen McHugh, who was the head of AWP, said, we all know that the Iraq War is going to start. And I wonder if there's anything that we as psychologists and women psychologists can do. And when she said that, I had this image. It was like a movie of the next veterans coming home, emotionally devastated. And I thought, what has changed since our last war? What's changed is that our country has become even more psychiatrized than before. And this vision I had, which it was a nightmare, I thought, what's going to happen is all these people will come home devastated, and now not just the traditional therapist, but the whole country will say, we know what that is. That's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a mental illness. Send them to a therapist. Please close the door behind you. We don't want to hear about it. And get on drugs. I thought that was going to happen. I feared that was going to happen. It has happened on a grander scope than I had ever feared. And so I never dreamed I would end up meeting with some of the top brass at the Pentagon. Last March, my book had just come out, the book about veterans, and I found myself getting off the metro in Arlington, Virginia, and there it was, the Pentagon, and my heart was pounding, and I thought, they'll probably hang me, they'll scream at me, they'll say, why are you here? You don't know what the hell you're talking about. And I met with 3 people who are very high up in the Pentagon. And I don't have their permission to say who they were, so I won't, because they're having a tough time of it. I was so touched by what I heard. I had been promised half an hour. I stayed for an hour and 15 minutes at their request. And when I said, I'm alarmed, because it's hard enough to go through the hell of war and then trying to come home. Because just imagine, if you know somebody who's done their junior year abroad in Argentina, I knew a student at Harvard who did that. She loved her friends at Harvard. She loved her courses. She went to Argentina. She had a wonderful time there. She loved the people. She learned a lot. She came back and she freaked out because she was different than the person she used to be. But all her old friends thought she was exactly who she had been before. And she didn't know what to do about that. Now imagine if instead of Argentina, war is where you've gone to. And you come back, and 93% of people in this country haven't a clue, whether they're anti-war or pro-war, they haven't a clue what you've been through. Veterans I've interviewed from World War II right up through the present wars will tell you it doesn't matter if they were military because so had their grandfather and their father been. It didn't matter if they had played with toy soldiers as a kid, if they were fascinated with war history. It didn't matter that they'd been through basic training. It didn't matter that they'd been through advanced training. They all say nothing prepares you for what war really is. Nothing can prepare you. So we haven't been there. So what I understood when I met with these people at the Pentagon, and since then have been in touch with someone else who's very highly placed in the Pentagon, is it's not the Pentagon that decides who's going to go to war. Of course, it's the government. And so then the Pentagon, they do their job. They try to make the war happen as it's supposed to happen, according to military rules, and then they see up close the emotional devastation. And when they're trying to decide, where do we get help for our people because they're suffering? Well, then they thought to themselves, who is it who knows how to help people who are suffering emotionally? The mental health professions. So they turned to the traditional mental health professions, and that's why the only two things that anybody ever thinks about when vets go to see them in the traditional systems are therapy and drugs. Now, the vets that I interviewed, they told me, some of them said therapists did horrible things to them. The best thing I heard, two things. One was, she was a really nice lady, but I don't live in her office, I live out there. And she gets paid to say those nice things. And she gets paid to be supportive, right? So they're saying, even at the very least, therapy's not enough. The one person, the one vet who ever told me that the therapist had been very helpful was a Vietnam vet. And I said to him, who was the therapist? Well, David Collier. He runs the vet center in Salem, Oregon. I called Dr. Collier, he's a psychologist, and I said, tell me what you do. I know what the vet told me that you do that's helpful. You tell me what you do that's helpful. And he said, well, I listen. I tell them they don't have to get it all out at once. I tell them to slow down and breathe. I tell them I will be here. And I said, well, that's really interesting because, there are people using these techniques, EMDR, and exposure to videos that help them relive the experience, and drugs, and so on. I said, and you don't do that. And he said, well, when techniques work, they work because of the relationship. And then he went on to say, this guy himself is a Vietnam veteran, this psychologist. He went on to say the following thing, and I've never heard anybody use this word in the traditional mental health system. He said, in our training programs, we sort of pussyfoot around and we call it empathy, but it's really love. That's what he said. So I loved that. I put it in my book. And then I said to him, can you tell me, I said, from what you described and what the vet that you saw described, what is it that you do that's helpful that non-therapists can't do, that people who have no training cannot do? And he said, absolutely nothing. All right. Now, so the VA has been alarmed, and so has the military, by the indices of suffering in its service members and its veterans. The suicide rates keep going up. In my book, there are two chapters. One is called What the Military is Doing and Why It's Not Enough, and the other is called What the VA is Doing and Why It's Not Enough. And most of those chapters is based on the press releases from the military itself and from the VA. And what you see is, over the years since the Iraq War started, They make these statements about how there's all this suffering, the suicide rates are high, the homelessness, the substance abuse, the family breakdown. We don't know why. So we're introducing a new program. And then you hear that for year after year after year after year. And what's happened to those rates, those indices of despair and suffering? They just keep going up. Why is that? Well, you know what? Guess what has been shown from the beginning to be correlated with suicide? Deployments. It's war that does it. It's being at war. But of course, if you're in the military or you're in the VA, it's the one thing that you're not allowed to say, this is what would make those rates go down. So, what reason do we have to think that the ways to alleviate the anguish, the terror, the guilt, the shame, the loss of innocence, the moral crises that come from war are the same things that help when those feelings are caused by more usual things that therapists work with?